and inclined his head to the butler. The butler turned to Eleanor and intoned, "The master is busy, but he will receive you soon. In the meantime, ma'am, I'm Bridgeport. May I take your cloak and bonnet?" Although noon had passed, the mists outside subdued the sunlight into a wash of grey. The light of the candles couldn't illuminate the dark corners of Mr. Knight's enormous entry, an entry built to communicate, in the surest way possible, the owner's wealth. Eleanor's nostrils quivered with scorn. Bridgeport jumped a little, as if anticipating her ripping at him as a substitute for his master. Of course Mr. Knight would take this house. He wanted everyone to know he was rolling in riches. He was, after all, nothing more than an upstart American who dreamed of marrying a title. Yet the entry was decorated with velvet draperies of evergreen and gold, and with a profusion of cut glass and beveled mirrors in marvellous good taste. Eleanor comforted herself with the thought that Mr. Knight had bought it in this condition, and was even now planning to gut it and install gilt in the Chinese fashion, a style fully as vulgar as— Eleanor's mouth quirked with humour— as vulgar as was adored by the Prince of Wales himself. Bridgeport relaxed and returned to his stolid demeanour. He watched her much too closely, because he thought she was the Duchess, or because his master had so instructed him. She removed her bonnet, stripped off her gloves, placed them in the dark bonnet, and handed them to the butler without a trace of outer trepidation. After all, what was the point of showing trepidation? It would merely be another proof that, although Eleanor had travelled across war-torn Europe as the Duchess's companion, she hadn't acquired the verve and confidence that characterized Madeline's every move. This wasn't from lack of trials. The two women had faced trials aplenty. It was because— Eleanor sighed as she allowed the butler to take her cloak. Eleanor was born timid. She never remembered a time when her father's shouting hadn't paralyzed her with fright, or when her stepmother's narrow-eyed glare hadn't had the power to turn her into a bowl of quivering blancmange. Which is why Eleanor cultivated a serene facade. She might be a coward, but she saw no reason to announce the fact. "If you would follow me, Your Grace, to the large drawing-room, I will order refreshments," Bridgeport said. "You must be tired after your long journey." "Not so long." Eleanor followed him through the tall door off to the left. "I stayed at the Red Robin Inn last night and spent only 4 hours on the road this morning." The butler's impassivity slipped, and for a moment an expression of horror crossed his countenance. "Your Grace, if I might make a suggestion, when dealing with Mr. Knight, it's best not to tell him that you failed to obey his instructions with all speed." Turning from her contemplation of the elegantly appointed room, she raised her eyebrows in haughty imitation of her cousin and gazed at the butler in a frigid silence. It must have worked, for Bridgeport bowed. "Your pardon, Your Grace, I'll send for tea." "Thank you," Eleanor said with composure. "And more substantial refreshments also," for she suspected Mr. Knight intended to keep her waiting, and it had been 5 hours since breakfast. Bridgeport left Eleanor to scrutinize her grandiose prison. Tall windows let in the timid sunlight, and the candles washed the walls with a pleasant golden glow. Books lined one wall, reaching all the way to the 12-foot ceiling, and the furniture was stylishly striped in an austere pattern of crimson and cream. The oriental rug was crystal blue and crimson flowers on a cream background, and crimson roses nodded in the tall blue and white oriental vases. The scent of leather bindings, fresh carnations, and oiled wood blended to create a familiar smell, a smell that seemed to Eleanor to be uniquely British. This room had been created to put a guest at ease. Eleanor would not relax. Such a lack of vigilance could not be wise, and in truth, when she thought about meeting Mr. Knight, her stomach twisted into knots. But neither would she dance to Mr. Knight's tune. He no doubt imagined she would grow more anxious the longer she waited. Well, she would, but he would never know. With every appearance of airiness, she wandered to the bookshelves and examined the titles. She found the Iliad and the Odyssey, and sniffed in disdain. Mr. Knight was a barbarian from the colonies, and therefore unschooled. Probably the former owner had left the books. Or perhaps Mr. Knight had acquired the books so he could sniff the richness of their bindings. Yet a worn title caught her eye, a book by Daniel